So is consuming dietary fiber beneficial? It's a very common question that I get asked. Now, quickly to respond to this, I do think that consuming certain whole foods that do provide fiber can be beneficial to certain people. Now, I want to address some of the claims that are being made right now around fiber and, like, let's say swapping out animal foods for plant foods. What type of evidence is being used to support these claims and why this is not evidence-based. And then I'll go into some more better evidence-based reasons why I think consuming foods that have some fiber can be beneficial. So first, there are people out in the space claiming and using things like the NHANES data to suggest that fiber reduces the risk of cancer or all-cause mortality. Now, the NHANES data simply used a 24-hour dietary recall at baseline 1 or 2 times, and then they followed people up for 5 to 20 years. So we need to understand that this is not science. This is very, very poor science that cannot prove causation. But there's people making causative claims based on NHANES and based on studies like the Nurses' Health Study and the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study. Those 2 latter studies, they didn't use dietary recalls. They used food frequency questionnaires every 2 to 4 years. So that cannot reflect what someone's consuming every single day for decades to inform us on what's actually reducing risk of whatever. So these are very, very poorly done studies that cannot prove causation. You have to have a metabolic ward study that controls for all factors besides what you're looking at, let's say an increase in fiber intake, to prove causation. We've never done that studies. We'll never get those studies done. From an ethical perspective, we can't lock people up for 30 years, and thus we'll never have those type of causative studies. So anyone using NHANES, Nurses' Health Study, or the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study to make causative claims like if you eat more fiber, you will reduce your risk of cancer or heart disease, that is a complete lie. That is not based on truth. That is anti-science because it cannot prove causation. You can say that in these studies, these poorly done studies that did 1 or 2 dietary recalls at baseline, and by the way, a dietary recall, most people underreport what they ate by 20 to 30%, let alone, so even for a single day, most people don't even fully remember what they ate in the previous 24 hours. They underreport by 20 to 30%. To think that one dietary recall or 2, because sometimes they would do a follow-up call, dietary recall with those people 3 to 10 days later from baseline, and then they would just use those 2 dietary recalls to assume that that's what they're consuming for 20 years, which is insane. But anyway, it can't even encapsulate what someone consumed the previous 24 hours. Most people can't remember what they ate in the previous 24 hours. So to try to use that study to make any type of claim in regards to eating 10 grams more of fiber reduces your risk of cancer or heart disease by X amount is just crazy, because we don't know exactly what these people ate because we did not lock them in a metabolic ward and control for everything and actually observe what these people consumed. We did a dietary recall on day 1, and maybe we did a second dietary recall 3 to 10 days later over the phone, and then we assumed that's what they were consuming over the course of 5 to 20 years. So these are observational studies. They are not clinical trials. So we can't say based on those studies that consuming more plant foods, like let's say consuming like 3 more ounces of plant foods reduces your risk of cancer or all-cause mortality. No, it does not. That cannot prove that. You cannot use that data to support that claim. You can say in those studies, there was an association with a lower risk of cancer or heart disease, but this data cannot prove causation because it's based on 2 dietary recalls over the course of 20 years. So in other words, it's complete garbage, to be fair. And people shouldn't be using those studies to make those types of claims. So moving forward, anyone that uses NHANES, anyone who uses Nurses' Health Study, anyone who uses the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study to try to make causative claims on hard health outcomes like cancer or all-cause mortality or heart disease, that is anti-science, and you should not do that moving forward. Now, with all that being said, I am still a proponent of consuming certain whole food plant foods that bring some fiber for numerous reasons. There have been randomized control trials looking at, let's say, eating a burger bun with meat and then consuming that with an avocado, let's say, or half of an avocado. And so you control for everything. You bring them into the hospital. Let's say you bring them into like a metabolic unit. You can control what they're eating, and you can observe under that time that you're observing them for, let's say 6 hours, that there's a decrease in like postprandial, this means after meal, oxidative stress and inflammation markers. So when you add an avocado to a burger, that does decrease those oxidative stress markers and inflammation markers. So great, that's a nice checkbox for adding an avocado to a burger. So I do think that's at least stronger evidence because it's a randomized controlled trial. Other clinical randomized control trials that have looked at this too have looked at like adding whole food fiber to a meal. It's not just meat, but it's higher in meat, let's say. And then they add fiber to that in the forms of cruciferous vegetables or other, whole foods, or even certain supplements too. And what that does is it actually decreases what are called DNA adducts, which are chemical modifications of DNA, which can potentially lead to cancer in the colon. So there's some randomized control trials that do suggest adding certain whole food, whole plant foods to, let's say, red meat, reduces, precancerous markers, what are called these DNA adducts in colonocytes, which are our colon cells. So to me, that's better information. And then we have we have 3 metabolic wart studies actually looking at, and many other studies as well, that plant foods decrease the acid load of animal foods and improve the calcium balance and improve markers of bone breakdown and bone formation. So to me, that is better evidence too to support adding some low oxalate plant foods to an animal-based diet. So if you're going to support plant foods, please focus on the randomized control trials that can prove causation. Stop, tapping the NHANES data. Stop tapping, the nurses' health study, and stop tapping the health professionals' follow-up study, because it just decreases basically the message that we're trying to put out in regards to, good evidence and health outcomes.